Hey everyone, it's Jeremiah from Alamance Battleground. It's a few days after the battle and it's time to get started again with Tryon's March real-time updates. Now today is May 19th. It's been a few days since the Battle of Alamance. So today what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about what has transpired since the battle and then what is going on today on the 19th. Now, immediately after the battle, Governor Tryon and his militia march back to the Great Alamance Camp. They get there at 5 o'clock in the evening on the 16th, and they're going to stay there for a few days. And a few things happen during that time of some note. On the 17th, Governor Tryon issued a proclamation, and this proclamation states that any regulators who come into his camp and offer up their arms, they surrender up their arms and sign an oath of allegiance and promise to pay any outstanding taxes or taxes that might be levied. If they do all three of those things, then nothing more will be said to them and they will receive a pardon. It's an amnesty that is offered to most of the regulators. Now, the only people who are not included in this are regulator leaders who have already been named in pieces of legislation like the Johnston Riot Act. So Herman Husband, James Hunter, Redknapp Howell, William Butler, these people are not going to be included in this proclamation, and the militia is still going to be hunting for them and still confiscating their property because of the authority that they have by that Johnston Riot Act. The other thing that happens on May 17th is one of the regulator prisoners is taken and hanged in front of the army. It's a man named James Few, and we don't know exactly why it is James Few who is chosen to be executed, but there is an explanation that's given for why this execution takes place. And the hanging, it says, gave great satisfaction to the men, and at this time it was a necessary sacrifice to appease the murmurings of the troops, who were importunate that public justice should be immediately executed against some of the outlaws that were taken in the action, and in opposing of whom they had braved so many dangers, and suffered such loss of lives and blood, and without which satisfaction some refused to march forward, while others declared they would give no quarter for the future. So this tells us a lot about the disposition of the militia and their thirst for blood at this time, having just been through a very costly engagement at the Battle of Alamance. And so after Few is hanged, the army still stays in camp at Great Alamance for another day. And yesterday on May 18th, the army was taking up all of the items that had been captured on the battlefield, and they were delivering them to the artillery so that the value of those items could be tallied. That value will be determined, and then the cost is tallied up, and the money that is going to be made from the sale of those items is then going to be distributed evenly amongst the men in the militia. So that is done yesterday, as well as moving the sick and the wounded to the home of Michael Holt, and the surgeon is directed to hire nurses from the local area, and they are going to take care of the sick and wounded while the army marches forward. And so yesterday, Tryon began the process of moving further west into the backcountry. The first thing that he does is split his force, and the second line of his militia, which is going to be under the command of Colonel John Ash, is directed to march west, and they encamp at Lowe's Mill on Stinking Quarter Creek. That's where I am right now. Stinking Quarter Creek is immediately behind me, and it is near this area where that second line camps, and it's actually overnight on the 18th and today where we see that the military situation is still very tense, and we see why Governor Tryon is still approaching this as an active military campaign and why he's still approaching the regulators as an active rebellion. Now, once he sets up the camp here, Colonel Ash gets some word that there are regulators in the area that are moving to surround his force. And when Tryon comes up with his force and connects with Ash today on the 19th, he does find out that there was a little bit of action here between the Regulators and Ash's second line, that part of the army that was encamped here at Lowe's Mill. And that does get mentioned in the campaign journal for today. The army marched early this morning and joined the second line before 12. Colonel Ash informed the governor he had been surrounded all night by 300 of the rebels, but by keeping his men very alert under arms, the enemy was deterred from attacking his camp, excepting a small party which shot one of his sentries through the shoulder and took another prisoner from his post. So at this point, even though Tryon has won the Battle of Alamance, the Regulators are still out there. They're taking prisoners. They are shooting and injuring sentries in Tryon's militia. And so there is no indication that this is necessarily over. And so the army is going to continue to operate as they have, staying under arms, keeping sentries, and continuing to use the parole and countersign system. So today's parole is Maryland, and the countersign is Boston. The army is going to continue moving west now that they have united here at Lowe's Mill, and they are going to continue on in the pursuit of Regulator leaders like Herman Husband and James Hunter. I'm going to be back in a couple of days to talk about those encampments that take place at the homes of Hunter and Husband and what happens there. Now, one more note, specifically regarding weather. Obviously, we've got a lot of rain today on May 19th, and this is some sort of historically appropriate weather, and the militia is about to run into a really long stretch where the weather turns very bad. And we'll talk about that a little bit more because it gets mentioned in the campaign journal every single day. And I know there have been some of you who have been interested in knowing what the weather was like at this time, and this is going to be where we get the most detail about that. So stay tuned for that information in our next Tryon March real-time video. In a couple days, we'll be back on May 21st to talk about the militia's movements, the weather, and what they are facing against the Regulators. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you again in a couple of days.